And we know about John and his disciples and the enormous number of... he had thousands and thousands of disciples. And he preached to the Gentiles. And whatever it was he preached, we are told, excited people to the utmost. So it wasn't just, oh, you're a bunch of sinners, get in the river. It was actually something exciting. It was something that really got them going. In fact, this is a very interesting thing. John the Baptist is a star in the one of the few secular records of the time, Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus describes John as being a famous name, who had thousands of people flocking around, Gentiles too. And guess who isn't mentioned by Josephus at all? Jesus. We always think of Jesus as being the big one, don't we? We always think of him as being the one everybody knew about. But he's not there. Actually, I tell you, he is there. He's there because medieval monks were so embarrassed by the lack of Jesus' mention in Josephus that they actually added him. So he is there, but it's a fake. Josephus says that something different too about John the Baptist, how John the Baptist ended his days. Because we know from the Bible that there's this very unconvincing story, isn't there, of how Herod arrests John the Baptist for denouncing his marriage, his illicit marriage, and bangs him up in jail. And then there's this dancing girl, a kind of lap dancer, who is actually his stepdaughter. And we think, don't we, that her name is Salome. And we think, don't we, that we get that from the Bible. In fact, we don't, because her name isn't mentioned. We get it from Josephus. He calls her Salome. So that's how we know. When she says, I want the holy man's head on a platter, give it to me now. And so she gets it, and that's pretty much it, isn't it, for John the Baptist. In fact, he doesn't appear at all, except in the odd line when people talk about him in the New Testament. But John was incredibly important, as I say. Josephus said so. And he tells us that, in fact, John was not arrested by Herod because he criticised his marriage. He was arrested because he was so popular, so famous, that Herod arrested him as a preemptive strike because he thought there'd be an uprising against him, headed by John, or certainly by John's disciples. In fact, after John's death, Josephus also tells us, shortly before John's death, I've lost my place completely. Shortly after John was executed, Herod's army was actually defeated in battle. And the people said to Herod, well, that just shows you shouldn't have done that. That's nemesis. That's what happens. You know, God is doing this to you because you killed the holy man. You killed John. So this was the people. John was so big, and the people were agitating. They were saying, you should not have killed the Baptist. This is what it comes to if you do things like that. There's also an episode in the Gospels that confirms John's popularity was greater than Jesus. We're told that on one occasion, when Jesus was preaching to the crowds in Jerusalem, some of the chief priests came to ask him a test question in order to trick him. And they demanded that he tell them on what authority he speaks. And Jesus responds with a counter-question. He asked them, where did they think John the Baptist's authority came from? Was it from heaven or was it from man? The answer being obviously implicit, that was John a holy man or not? And this catches the chief priests out. If they realise that if they say from heaven, that Jesus will say, all right, then why didn't you recognise him as a great holy man? Why didn't they accept him? But if they answer of man, then the crowd will turn against them. But notice, most people miss the point there. Jesus uses John's popularity to make his point. It's John, John, John. Even Jesus uses John, and John's name when he can. It's a very clever point. It's shrewd politically, but it's all about John the Baptist. It's not about his own popularity. And we know that John's following survived his death, becoming, well, not becoming necessarily, some of them already were, what we call the Mandaens. And it was no minor sect, because there's a dead giveaway in the New Testament, in the Acts of the Apostles. Because when St. Paul, who believed that he was the first Christian missionary to go to the lands around the Mediterranean, when he arrived in Ephesus and Corinth, he was astonished to see, apparently, Christian churches already flourishing there. And he said, and these aren't his verbatim words, by the way, he said, "Excuse me, who are you?" to the people in these churches. And they said, "We're the Church of John the Baptist." And he said, all right then. In that case, you'll be pleased to see me, because I represent, it's like a Hoover salesman, sorry. He said, I represent the church of the one that John said was to come. And they said, "Sorry, you've lost us, mate. Don't know what you're talking about." Because John never said it. John never prophesied that there was one greater, who was Jesus, to come. John never grovelled at Jesus' feet. This is very interesting, isn't it? It changes quite a lot of things, and it goes on changing them, believe me. We've only scraped the surface. All the indications are that John's church, based in Alexandria, was much bigger than Jesus's and a threat to Jesus and his movement. It was also established well in advance of Jesus' church in foreign lands. But also, it's now known that there were John Gospels. There were Gospels written with John as the hero. And you might say, well, that's very interesting. Where are they? Good question, in the case of most of them. But don't forget that history is written by the victors. And what we're actually looking at in the New Testament is, as Steve pointed out, and I can only endorse ringingly, is actually propaganda on behalf of the Jesus Party. Where is the John literature? Where is the John propaganda, if you like? Well, amazingly, it is known that some of it was actually absorbed into the New Testament. They just changed the name of the hero. And one of my favourite examples of the John literature being used, being recycled for Jesus' lot, is the Magnificat. You know, that very, very lovely verse which the Virgin Mary is supposed to have spoken when she discovers she's pregnant with Jesus. And she says, "My soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit rejoice in God my Saviour," and so on. And it's lovely. And it's particularly loved by women in the Catholic Church, for example. Yes, except that originally that particular song was spoken in the John literature by Elizabeth, John's mother. It was simply taken over by the Jesus Christians and used for their ends. And we've already seen how the Lord's Prayer has its origins in Egypt, in the Book of the Dead. But there's another thing about the Lord's Prayer. How it came about, how it was in the New Testament, was that Jesus' disciples went up to him one day and said, "Lord, teach us to pray, as John taught his disciples to pray." And it's usually assumed that Jesus invented the Lord's Prayer, and therefore it's particularly precious to Christians because it's the one thing, in a way, that we have of Jesus' own words, except they're not, as we've seen, go back to Egypt. But the latest interpretation of the situation is that Jesus taught his disciples to pray using the same words that John used to teach his disciples how to pray. In other words, the Lord in the Lord's Prayer is in fact John, not Jesus. So it's a kind of case of mistaken identity, somewhat deliberate, but there you are. There's also a perfect example of the snaffling, of the stealing of John literature. It's quite a far-reaching one, is the borrowing by the writers of the New Testament of the beginning of the John literature, in which they've turned into the beginning of the Gospel of John. By the way, it's coincidence, the name John there. The teaching, the lovely lyrical teaching, the mystical part, including in the beginning was the Word, at the beginning of the Gospel of John, and many of the teachings given to Jesus, by Jesus to his disciples, they come from John. Now, John was a Gnostic teacher. Steve said the Mandaens, his followers, Gnostics. They believe in the light. They believe in a personal knowledge of the divine. Although they have priests who will help them understand these things, they don't rely on them as one might in the church to tell you the doctrine, to tell you all about God's love for you. You feel it, you know it, you experience the light, and you understand the darkness, what it entails. John was also, of course, as Steve pointed out, associated with another infamous Gnostic. His successor was Simon Magus, the church's first hated heretic, which again removes John and his associates from the Christian story. I said he's not a Christian martyr. His successor was the first Christian heretic. And his successor also, Simon Magus, was a sex magician. He was into sacred sexuality, something akin to Tantrism of the East, which certainly removes him from the idea that being tainted, if you like, with the same brushes. John the Baptist, this great John Knox-like Puritan figure, who appoints a sex magician as his successor. It doesn't work, does it? So again, the image of John is very different. There's underlying it are suggestions that John was a much more dynamic, much more exciting person than the Jesus propaganda of the New Testament would have us believe. But what about his relationship with Jesus? Well, we've seen it's very, very unlikely indeed that he would have actually grovelled at Jesus' feet because they were bitter rivals. But I often use the analogy because we're looking at the Jesus propaganda, the New Testament. If in 2,000 years' time all we had to understand the politics of Britain in the 1980s was a propaganda of the Tory party, and we read how Arthur Scargill knelt to Margaret Thatcher, we wouldn't know any different, would we? We'd go around talking about it, say, isn't it wonderful? With stained glass windows would, reproduce the event. This is what we have. We have the propaganda of the Jesus party telling us how the great rival of Jesus, perhaps even they were enemies, we might go that far, it's not certain, but we might, kneeling to Jesus. There's something nasty about that when you begin to get the underlying feeling and knowing about the John literature and knowing about the things that I'm going to tell you now.